The threat archivist's name was Sovin Kethrol, and he had catalogued 4,312 weapons. I know that number because he told me. Twice. The second time he said it very slowly, in the way people say numbers when they want you to understand that the number is the point, not the weapons, not the species who'd surrendered them under duress or treaty or simple biological exhaustion, but the count itself. 4,312. Every one indexed, cross-referenced by yield class, delivery mechanism, target specificity, and what he called, in the clipped tonal language of the Kethsavan, the endurance coefficient, how long, after first deployment, the weapon's damage continued to accumulate. He had an entire subcategory for weapons whose damage accrued across generations. He seemed particularly proud of that one. I nodded. I said it was an impressive body of work. He looked at me the way the Kethsavan always looked at humans when we said something they couldn't immediately categorize. A slight tightening of the outer gill frills, a pause that was a fraction too long to be natural. And then he moved on to the formal requirements of the Senate exchange. That was the thing I had 48 hours to survive. The Senate exchange was the Kethsavan's mandatory ritual for first contact diplomatic sessions. Every species, before any substantive negotiation could begin, was required to present its primary deterrent weapon for formal declaration and classification. The Kethsavan called this the Senate, the word translated roughly as the ledger made honest, and it had been their protocol for 600 years. The principle was simple. You couldn't negotiate a fair territorial arrangement with a species whose threat profile you hadn't indexed. The Kethsavan didn't trust goodwill. They trusted data. The ledger was the relationship. I had been briefed on this. I had been briefed on everything. I had been briefed for 11 months by the diplomatic corps' finest xenoculture specialists, and I had read every intercept we had on Kethsavan negotiating history, and I had sat in so many simulated exchanges in the corps training annex on Callaway Station that I had started dreaming in Senate Kethval tonal clusters. I was, by every measurable standard, as prepared as a human being could be for this moment. What the briefings had not been able to fix was the underlying problem. I had nothing to offer them. Not nothing in the vague, diplomatic way people say they have nothing when they mean they have something, but don't want to show it yet. Nothing in the literal, precise sense. The 17 colony lanes the Kethsavan were moving to close under territorial exclusion were lanes we needed, agricultural transports, medical resupply chains for 6 outer stations, the corridor that ran through the Varath drift that kept the Sarat compact's early settlement clusters from going dark for 6 months every second year. We had asked the Kethsavan for consideration. We had filed the appropriate requests. The appropriate requests had been filed in response to our filing, and those filings had been responded to, with further filings requiring additional responses. And the whole thing had accumulated into the particular kind of bureaucratic coral reef that the Kethsavan built around any problem they preferred not to solve quickly. 48 hours before I landed in the Senate Vol receiving chambers, the Kethsavan's senior coordinating body had sent formal notice that unless the Senate exchange produced a satisfactory threat declaration from humanity, they would invoke territorial right, and the lanes would close in 30 days. 30 days, 6 outer stations, 600,000 people. My supervisor, a veteran diplomat named Orlin Brass, had called me the night before my shuttle docked and told me one thing. Myra, don't fold. Whatever happens in there, don't fold. They've got better catalogs than leverage, and a species that runs on catalogs can always be confused by a gap. I'd asked him what gap. He'd said, that's what you're going in there to find. Then he'd ended the call. So that was the situation. I walked into the Senate Vol receiving chambers at 6 minutes past the 4th morning bell, which was the exact appointed time, and I looked at the chamber and I thought, well, at least the room is beautiful. It was beautiful. I'll say that much for the Kethsavan. They built their deliberative spaces the way some civilizations build temples, with the express intention of making the visitor feel simultaneously welcomed and very small. The receiving chambers ran the full height of the administrative spire, which was 17 stories of raw vol crystal, a mineral native to the Keth homeworld that was somewhere between obsidian and smoked glass, mined in slabs and cut into facing panels that lined every wall in the chamber from floor to vaulted ceiling. The crystal was not dark. That was the thing that surprised every human who saw it for the first time. It was described in every briefing document as dark crystal, and I had imagined something shadowed, interior, the kind of material that absorbs light. The vol crystal didn't absorb light. It collected it, held it, and then let it go very slowly, in shifting currents that moved through the panels in long, gradual waves the way heat moves through still water. At any given moment, at the noon hour, the walls were doing something between refracting and radiating. The light came in through the canopy, and the chamber transformed it into something different, something amber and white and pale gold all at once, and the whole space felt like standing inside a held breath. Noon light poured through the canopy overhead. The canopy was woven carbon and tensile alloy, designed to filter the star's harder frequencies while letting the softer spectrum through. And the result was that the room was not bright in the harsh way of a floodlit hall but bright in the way of a clear morning, even, sourceless, everywhere at once. The delegation was already seated. There were 9 of them. The Keth Savan ran their diplomatic sessions in odd numbers for reasons that were explained in one of the briefing documents I had read and subsequently failed to retain, something about bilateral symmetry being associated in their older philosophical traditions with stasis and dead ground. Odd numbers implied motion. Motion implied negotiation was still possible. I found this quietly charming. I also found it deeply unhelpful in the moment, because the 9 of them were seated at the long curved table in a way that made it feel like a 12-to-1 ratio. Sovin Kethrol was third from the left. He had the posture of a man who had spent 600 years waiting for everyone else to understand how things were done. The gill frills ran from the hinge of the jaw down along the neck to the collarbone. In the Keth Savan's formal colors, they were closed, furled tight, the deep charcoal of an unthreatened member of the senior archivist caste. His hands were folded on the table. His index register, the physical ledger, because the Keth Savan still maintained physical copies of everything, which I had also found charming and also unhelpful, was closed beside his left hand. He did not open it. He was the kind of official who didn't need to check his notes because his notes were him. I took my seat across the table. There was a chair for me and one empty chair to my left for a second delegation member that I hadn't brought, because there was no second delegation member. Orlin had authorized exactly 1 person for this contact, on the grounds that sending 2 humans to a session we couldn't win just meant 2 humans watching us lose. The session opened with the formal Voth Keth salutation, which ran approximately 4 minutes and involved a recitation by the eldest member of the delegation of the lineage of the Senate Exchange, the 12 founding principles of Keth Savan diplomatic law, and a spoken affirmation that all parties present were acting as acknowledged representatives of their respective governing bodies, with full authority to bind. I had practiced the human response to this, which was considerably shorter, 6 sentences affirming reciprocal standing and acknowledging the terms of the exchange, and I delivered it cleanly, with the tonal marks in the right positions, and I saw Sovin Kethrol's gill frills twitch very slightly in what the briefings had said was the Keth Savan equivalent of mild approval. Then the session coordinator, a younger official named Vethsa Loren, who wore the green-edged collar of a protocol officer, announced the formal opening of the Senate. "The exchange begins," Vethsa Loren said. "The Keth Savan coordinating body presents its primary deterrent to the representatives of the human diplomatic collective. Classification, Category 7, Cascade Disruption. The Vethsal Array, Range 43 systems. Endurance coefficient indefinite until manually ceased, declared and received. This was the part of the exchange I had found most unnerving in the briefings, and it was still unnerving in person. The Keth Savan didn't hide their weapons. They named them. They gave you the specs. The whole principle of the Senate was mutual transparency. You showed yours, they showed theirs, and then everyone at the table knew exactly how catastrophic things could get. The theory was that full disclosure made genuine negotiation possible. The actual effect in practice was that one side of the table had just told you, in formal procedural language, that they could unmake 43 star systems and keep doing it until someone manually made them stop. I kept my expression neutral. I had practiced that too. Veth Saloran looked at me. The 9 members of the delegation looked at me. The room held its bright, amber-shifted breath. The human representative, Veth Saloran said, is invited to present humanity's primary deterrent for formal declaration and classification. And there it was. I had known this moment was coming. I had known it was coming for 11 months. I had spent a significant portion of those 11 months trying to figure out what to say in it. The briefings had suggested a range of options. I could name one of the human fleet's capital-class weapons platforms, the Sovereign Series ships, which were genuinely formidable and which the Keth Savan probably already had partial intelligence on. I could reference our biological adaptation profile, the standard Deathworlder disclosure, the briefings called it, the recitation of human physiological extremes that some species found genuinely alarming. I could cite a number, casualty projections, force multipliers, the yield figures from the Kareth engagement, which were on public record and which any species with a competent intelligence apparatus had already read. Any of those would have been appropriate. Any of those would have fit the exchange's requirements. Any of those would have resulted in the Keth Savan's threat archive assigning humanity a coefficient, logging us in the index at the appropriate category, and moving forward with the exchange. Any of those would also have given the Keth Savan exactly what they needed to run their standard assessment, weighed our threat profile against theirs, determined that the Vethsal array outclassed anything we could bring to bear in a sustained territorial conflict, and proceed with the exclusion accordingly. They weren't going to be deterred by anything we had on the books. We knew that. Orlin had known it before he sent me. The Keth Savan's deterrent was objectively superior, and they were objectively correct to assess it that way. And the entire diplomatic situation was premised on the quiet understanding that if this went to confrontation, we would lose badly. What I needed was not to give them something they could assess. I needed the gap. I sat in the amber light of the Senate Vol receiving chambers and I thought about what Orlin had said. A species that runs on catalogs can always be confused by a gap. I thought about the index register beside Sovin Kethrol's hand. 4,312 weapons, category designations, endurance coefficients, every threat they'd ever encountered, indexed and cross-referenced, 600 years of meticulous accumulation. I thought about the one thing that cannot be cross-referenced because it is not in the index. The 9 members of the delegation were still looking at me. The silence had gone on long enough that Veth Saloran drew a small breath, preparatory to a prompt. I said Tuesday. I said it the way you'd name a geological formation. Flat, factual, slightly bored. The way you'd say basalt or granite or the specific technical designation for a stress fracture in a load-bearing wall. Something so fundamental, so obvious to anyone who knew what they were looking at, that explaining it would be almost condescending. Then I folded my hands on the table, exactly the way Sovin Kethrol had folded his, and I waited. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one that had come before. The silence before had been formal, the kind of silence that functions as punctuation, the held beat between one protocol step and the next. This silence was not formal. This silence had a texture to it. It moved through the room the way the light moved through the Vol crystal, not all at once, but in a slow current, touching each face at the table in turn, as each member of the delegation processed what I had said and found the same absence where understanding should have been. I watched Veth-Sa-Loran because Veth-Sa-Loran was the one whose job was to know things, and knowing things was not working for him right now. His stylus had been raised to make a notation in his protocol register. It was still raised. He hadn't written anything. His eyes were doing the rapid lateral movement that, in the Keth-Savan, indicated high-speed cross-referencing, accessing contextual memory, sorting, searching. He found nothing. I watched the moment he found nothing. It was subtle, a very slight slackening of the muscle around the secondary jaw joint, a blink that was slightly too slow for routine processing. He looked at his colleague to the immediate left, a junior archivist whose name I hadn't been given. The junior archivist gave him a fractional headshake. Sovin Kethral had not moved. His gill frills were still closed. His hands were still folded. But he was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on a Keth-Savan face before, and I had studied a great many Keth-Savan faces in the briefing materials. It was not alarm. It was not anger. It was something closer to the expression of a master craftsman who has just been shown a joint he cannot identify. The specific attentiveness of a person who has encountered a thing that should have a category and has discovered that the category is missing. "I beg your pardon," Veth-Sa-Loran said. His tonal marks were almost perfectly neutral. Almost. Would the human representative be willing to provide the standard classification metadata for the declared deterrent? I looked at him. "I've declared it," I said. "Tuesday. Classification follows from the declaration." This was bluffing. This was complete and total bluffing. I had no idea what classification Tuesday would fall under in the Keth-Savan threat index, because Tuesday was not in the Keth-Savan threat index. Tuesday was the second day of the 7-day human week, an interval of time averaging 24 hours, named for a sky deity from a northern European mythological tradition that had been dead for 2,000 years. It was the day I had been born. It was, statistically, the most productive day in the average human work cycle, according to 4 separate independent labor surveys I had read during an insomniac stretch on the shuttle. It was a word that existed in the Keth-Savan translation database. I knew that because the briefings had confirmed that our temporal vocabulary had been loaded into their systems during the initial contact exchange. But it existed there as a unit of time, not as anything that could meaningfully occupy a category in a threat classification system. What I was counting on was the Keth-Savan's deep, foundational, 600-year institutional commitment to not declaring ignorance in a formal session. The Senate exchange operated on the principle of mutual transparency. Both parties declared. The declarations were accepted, classified, and indexed. The Keth-Savan did not ask for clarification of declarations. To ask for clarification was to admit that the threat in question fell outside the parameters of their assessment framework. To admit that was to concede, formally and on the record, that their index had a gap. The Keth-Savan did not have gaps. Sovin Kethral unfolded his hands. He placed them flat on the table. He looked at me for a long moment. "The declaration is received," he said. His tonal marks were absolutely perfect. Veth-Sa-Loran wrote something in his register. I could not see what he wrote from where I sat. I had a fair idea it was not the standard 7-field classification entry. The session continued. There were 4 more procedural items to address before the substantive negotiation could open: the formal territorial claim statements, the acknowledgement of civilian transit records, the exchange of jurisdictional maps, the declaration of any extant third-party entanglements that might affect the negotiating scope. I addressed each item. I answered every question. I was careful and thorough, and I did not let my voice do anything other than the calibrated flatness of a diplomat doing a diplomatic job. What I was actually doing, under the flatness, was listening. The Keth-Savan did not break composure in formal session. I knew that. The briefings had been very clear on that point. What the briefings had also noted, in a footnote I had apparently retained better than the explanation for odd-numbered delegations, was that the Cuthsovan's back-channel communication during formal sessions was conducted via a set of low-frequency tonal pulses in a register below normal conversational Cuthsovan speech, not below human hearing as it turned out. Below the register that their own species associated with deliberate speech, which was a different threshold. The pulses were not speech, exactly. They were closer to what a human might call a running notation, a real-time annotation of the session being passed between delegation members at a frequency they apparently believed was inaudible to other species. I could hear them. I had not told the briefing team that I could hear them, because the briefing team had not known to ask, and because the relevant piece of my auditory profile, a mild but consistent sensitivity to infrasonic adjacent frequencies, documented in my core medical file as clinically unremarkable, had not seemed relevant to a diplomatic posting until the moment I sat in the amber light of the Sunat Vol receiving chambers and heard Sovan Cuthrell's primary assessment aide, a small, very still member of the delegation seated at the far right of the table, amid a sequence of tonal pulses that translated roughly as, "Cannot locate, no equivalent designation, query open, threat coefficient pending." Threat coefficient pending. They didn't have a coefficient for Tuesday. They had received a formal declaration of Tuesday as humanity's primary deterrent, and they could not assign it a threat coefficient, and they could not close the exchange without a coefficient, and they could not admit to any of this in formal session. And so what they had, for the first time in 600 years of meticulous indexing, was an open query. I finished the procedural items. The session coordinator announced the formal suspension of the Sunat Exchange pending classification review, which was a procedural mechanism I had not known existed until they invoked it, which meant it was not in the public briefing materials, which meant they had not invoked it in recent memory, possibly in a very long time. The delegation was courteous. The forms were completed. I was escorted back to the visitors' residential wing with a set of complimentary refreshments and the information that the classification review would require a minimum of 14 days. 14 days had become 93. I know because I counted. The first 14 days were almost peaceful. The Cuthsovan ran their classification review the way they ran everything, methodically, without visible urgency, and entirely out of sight. I was housed in the visitors' wing, which occupied the 15th floor of the administrative spire and looked out over the central plaza of the Sunat Vol City complex, a tiled expanse of the same Vol crystal as the chambers, crossed by covered walkways at multiple levels, anchored at the center by a water feature that moved too slowly to be called a fountain and too purposefully to be called still. Everything in the plaza moved with the same deliberate packing. The Cuthsovan citizens who crossed it, functionaries, archivists, the civilian support staff of the complex, moved as if they had always arrived exactly on time and always would. I communicated with Ullen via the core channel. Our communications were, I assumed, monitored. I told him the session had gone well. I told him the exchange had produced a declaration and that a classification review was underway. I told him I expected the review to conclude within the stated timeframe. Ullen, who was a man of very few wasted words, said, "What did you declare?" I said Tuesday. There was a silence of approximately 6 seconds. He said Myra. I said it seemed like the right move. There was another silence. Then Ullen said, in the particular tone of a veteran diplomat who has seen enough that very little surprises him but who is still, in this specific moment, surprised, "How long do you think that buys us?" "I don't know," I said. "Long enough to negotiate if we work fast." He was quiet again for a moment. Then, what did their faces do? Sovan Cuthrell's gilfrills didn't move at all, I said, which is worse than if they had. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Right, he said. I'll get you the back-channel team. Who do you need? I told him. He sent them within 3 days 2 trade analysts, a jurisdictional mapping specialist, and a Zona language negotiation aide who had worked 3 previous Cuthsovan contact cycles and who knew where the procedural bodies were buried. They came in officially as administrative support staff, which was a categorization that the Cuthsovan's hospitality protocols obligated them to accommodate. We set up in the visitors' wing. We worked. The back channel was not a secret channel in any dramatic sense. It was simply the informal communication pathway that ran between mid-level administrative contacts on both sides, the people whose job was to make the formal sessions work, which required them to communicate about the logistics of the formal sessions, which in turn created a natural and entirely sanctioned space for adjacent conversation. You couldn't negotiate the catering arrangements for a session break without also, incidentally, discussing when the session break might occur. You couldn't discuss when the session break might occur without discussing what the session would cover. You couldn't discuss what the session would cover without, eventually, discussing the substantive items. It took us 9 days to get to substantive items through that channel. It took another 12 to get to the transit lanes. It took 14 more to get to numbers. We were moving. For the first time in 8 months of filed correspondence and response filings and filings in response to responses, we were in a conversation that was going somewhere. The Cuthsovan mid-level administrative contacts were, I discovered, not unlike their equivalents in every other bureaucracy I'd ever worked in, pragmatic, task-oriented, faintly exhausted by the gap between what the formal process required and what the actual problem needed. They wanted the lanes resolved. They had always wanted the lanes resolved. The complexity was not intractability. It was the formal process's inability to create a space where resolution could happen without someone at the senior level losing face. The classification review had created that space. As long as the review was ongoing, the formal session was suspended, and while the formal session was suspended, the formal positions were technically unset. Technically unset positions could be discussed informally without binding either party. This was the gap. I also spent part of those 93 days thinking about what Sovan Cuthrell and his colleagues were actually doing. They were looking for Tuesday. I mean that in the most literal sense. I had told them, formally and on the record, that Tuesday was humanity's primary deterrent. The Cuthsovan's institutional commitment to their index meant they could not write that off as an error or a bluff without formally challenging the declaration. And formally challenging the declaration meant formally accusing me of lying in a Sonnet session, which was a serious procedural violation that would require its own review and would put the Cuthsovan in the position of having made an accusation they couldn't necessarily prove. They couldn't prove I hadn't meant it. I hadn't given them anything to prove it against. So they had to try to classify it. They started, I suspected, with the straightforward search. Tuesday in their database, unit of time, the second day of the human 7-day week, a temporal interval. They would cross-reference temporal intervals against their threat categories and find that no previous species had declared a unit of time as a primary deterrent, which would open a new query. What kind of weapon uses time as its active mechanism? The Cuthsovan knew about delayed-yield weapons. They knew about generational weapons, weapons whose damage accumulated across decades. The endurance coefficient subcategory had been built to handle those. But a unit of time isn't a delivery mechanism. It isn't a yield. It isn't a weapon in any technical sense they had a framework for. Which meant they were probably, somewhere in the depths of their archival apparatus, now asking a different question. Not what is Tuesday, but what does humanity do on Tuesday? I found this thought genuinely delightful. What did humanity do on Tuesday? We woke up. We went to work. We ate lunch at approximately the same time we always did, argued about the same things we always had, resolved them or failed to, went home, went to sleep, got up the next day and did it again. Tuesday was not different from Monday or Wednesday in any material respect. The statistical productivity figure I'd half remembered was almost certainly an artifact of how people felt about Tuesday relative to Monday. The immediate post-weekend difficulty of Monday making Tuesday feel, by comparison, more functional, which meant it was a social and psychological datum, not a physical one, and would tell you nothing useful about what Tuesday was as a weapon. It was possible, I realized, that the harder the Keth-Savan looked, the more confusing Tuesday would become. On day 41, I received a formal written inquiry through the session coordination channel. It was phrased in immaculate diplomatic Keth-Savan, 7 pages long, and contained 63 questions. 63. The questions were organized by category: temporal parameters, deployment mechanism, precedent instances, affected party case studies, and what was listed under the 5th category heading as philosophical or ideological basis, which I thought was almost admirably honest of them, an acknowledgement that they had considered whether Tuesday might be a belief system, a doctrine, or a value framework rather than a physical weapon. I answered all 63 questions. My answers were truthful. That was important to me. I had no desire to manufacture a deception that would hold under sustained examination, and beyond the strategic consideration, the Keth-Savan deserved truthful answers. My answers were also, necessarily, exactly as opaque as the truth was when applied to Tuesday. What is the temporal range of the deterrence effect? The full scope of the day, from midnight to midnight, after which the cycle resets. What constitutes a deployment event? Nothing specific initiates deployment. Tuesday arrives on its own schedule. How many precedent instances of deployment are on record? Approximately 2,000 per the human calendar in current use, not counting predecessor calendar systems. What characterizes a target? Any person, organization, event, or circumstance that exists within the temporal boundaries of the day. Can the deterrent be deactivated? No, it continues until midnight, at which point it resolves into Wednesday. I answered the philosophical or ideological basis questions with particular care. Is Tuesday associated with a religious tradition? Etymologically, yes. Functionally, no. Does Tuesday have symbolic or mythological significance in current human culture? Not primarily, no. Is Tuesday considered auspicious or inauspicious by human populations? Responses vary. There is no consensus. Some populations hold mild negative associations, others mild positive associations, and the majority hold no particular association at all. I sent the answers back through the session coordination channel. I went back to the transit lane negotiations. On day 63, I received a brief formal notice through the session channel. Not an inquiry, just a notice. The classification review had moved to its secondary assessment phase. Secondary assessment, according to the footnote on the notice, was invoked when a primary assessment produced a coefficient range wider than 3 threat categories. A range wider than 3 categories indicated a deterrent with unusual or ambiguous threat characteristics, and secondary assessment involved an expanded review body drawn from multiple archive subdisciplines. The review body had been expanded. I read the notice twice, then I passed it to Orland through the core channel without comment. He replied, "How many archive subdisciplines do they have?" I checked the briefing materials. 11, I said. Tuesday got all of them. The notice doesn't specify how many, I said, but the expanded body. A pause. How many weapons have ever gone to secondary assessment? I don't know, I said. The briefings don't cover secondary assessment. The briefings don't mention secondary assessment at all, which I suspect means no one they'd briefed before had ever triggered it. Another pause longer. Myra, Orland said. Sorry. Is there any chance they come back with a coefficient that puts us below the Vethsal array? I thought about it. Every chance in the world, I said. But they'll spend a long time getting there, and they won't be certain about it, and that's the point. A Keth Savan archive that isn't certain is a Keth Savan archive that isn't ready to move. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. Keep working the channel, he said. I kept working the channel. Day 78. The second formal written inquiry arrived. The Keth Savan mid-level contact I worked with most directly was a logistics administrator named Dethsa Laro, who was responsible for the practical coordination of transit filings across the territorial bloc. He was not a senior official. His role was explicitly procedural. He had no authority to negotiate anything. What he had was an extremely precise understanding of which lanes were generating administrative load for his department, and which lanes were nominal entries in the territorial claim that his department never actually touched. And he was willing, in the careful, plausibly deniable way of mid-level administrators in every bureaucracy I had ever encountered, to share that understanding across a table with the right person. I was the right person. We met in the administrative annex 3 levels below the visitor's wing, in a small conference room with a view of the service access routes rather than the central plaza. Dethsa Laro would bring his transit load charts. I would bring my jurisdictional mapping specialist. We would talk about filing volumes and routing logistics and the operational parameters of the corridor monitoring system. And through the particular alchemy of two professionals with adjacent problems and complementary data sets, we would talk about a solution without ever technically discussing the negotiation. On day 48, Dethsa Laro laid a transit chart on the table that showed a routing anomaly in the Vereth Drift corridor. The anomaly was the result of a boundary survey conducted 19 years prior that had used a reference point which had since been reclassified. The practical consequence was that the corridor's administrative boundary was drawn 7 degrees off from where the actual navigable channel ran. This mattered because the actual navigable channel passed through a section of space that fell within the 5 lanes the Keth Savan had no operational interest in, while the administrative boundary as drawn placed it inside one of the 12 lanes they actively monitored. Dethsa Laro pointed to this on the chart with a stylus. He said, "This is a well-documented mapping inconsistency. It has been pending correction for several administrative cycles." My jurisdictional mapping specialist looked at the chart. She looked at me. She looked at the chart again. A boundary correction of this kind would normally be processed as a routine administrative update, she said carefully, not a negotiating concession. Dethsa Laro agreed that it would normally be exactly that. We spent 3 more days drawing the corrected boundary on paper, not formally, not in any document that had a filing number. On paper, with a physical stylus in the administrative annex conference room, while we discussed transit load volumes and routing efficiency metrics. At the end of day 51, we had a boundary correction that moved the Vereth Drift corridor's navigable channel into clean Keth Savan administrative space, simplified the monitoring requirements for Dethsa Laro's department, and left the 5 operationally inactive lanes free to be released from the exclusion as a distinct territorial block. It was not an agreement. No agreement had been reached. What existed was a shared understanding between 2 mid-level professionals of a potential technical solution, which could, if the appropriate formal channels were ever in a position to consider it, form the basis of a framework that senior officials on both sides might find acceptable. Dethsa Laro gathered his charts at the end of day 51 and held them against his chest with the precise, careful posture of a man whose documentation was exactly what it appeared to be. He said, "The classification review proceeds." I said, "So I understand." He said, "The archive is thorough." "I don't doubt it," I said. He left. My mapping specialist watched the door for a moment after it closed, then turned to me with the expression of a person who has just participated in something that is technically not what it looks like. "Are we certain," she said, "that the archive is still working on Tuesday?" "I have it on good authority," I said, "that the archive has never worked on anything so diligently in its institutional memory." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you think they've found?" "More questions," I said. "That's what Tuesday does." On day 58, Orlin called with news that was not good. The 6 outer stations had begun to implement contingency protocols. The Sarit Compact's early settlement clusters in the Varath Drift had received formal notification from the regional supply coordinator that medical resupply for the second quarter was being staged closer to the inner lanes as a precautionary measure against access disruption. The coordinator's language was careful and professional, and it meant, in plain terms, that people 2 levels of administration below Orlin had looked at the situation and concluded that the lanes were probably going to close and had started making arrangements accordingly. "How bad?" I said. "Not bad yet," Orlin said. "The contingency staging adds 6 weeks to standard resupply timelines. It's manageable for now." "How long until it stops being manageable?" He was quiet for a moment. 3 months, maybe 4 if we stretch. After that, the Sarit clusters start running deficits on medical consumables and the agricultural transports go to manual rerouting, which cuts their effective capacity by 1/3. He paused. "So, how is the channel going?" I told him about Death Salaro and the boundary correction. I told him about Day 51 and the paper map and the shared understanding that wasn't technically an agreement. He listened. When I finished, he said, "But it needs a formal session." "It needs a formal session." "And the formal session needs the review to conclude." "Yes." A pause. "Can you push the archive from outside? Is there any contact you have with?" "No," I said. "I push the archive and they know I'm worried, and if they know I'm worried, the gap closes. The gap only works as long as they believe I'm not in a hurry." He understood that. He taught me that 11 months ago in a briefing room on Callaway Station, without knowing what it would apply to. "All right," he said. "I'll keep the station staged, don't rush." I didn't rush. But on day 62, a different kind of pressure arrived. Not from Orlin, from the Keth Savan. A brief administrative notice, through the session channel, informing me that the 30-day exclusion window originally cited in the coordinating body's notification had been held in abeyance during the classification review, as per review protocol, and would resume upon the review's conclusion. The notice was informational only. It was not a threat. It was the Keth Savan being exactly as precise about their procedures as they always were. What it meant was that the day the review concluded, the 30-day clock would restart. I filed the notice. I read it twice more. I communicated its contents to Orlin, who received them without comment. I went back to Death Salaro's boundary charts and confirmed for the 4th time that the numbers were right. Then I sat for a few minutes in the administrative annex conference room with the view of the service access routes, in the clean, even light that came through the carbon and alloy canopy, and I thought about the archive somewhere above me in the spire. Sovin Kethrol's staff working their way through the 14th theoretical framework, trying to fit Tuesday into a category it had never been designed to fit, and I thought, hold. Just hold. It was also not a deal that could be made through the back channel. The back channel could produce a framework that both sets of mid-level contacts understood, and that both sets of senior officials could agree to if a formal session could be convened on appropriate terms. The formal session couldn't be convened until the classification review concluded. The classification review couldn't conclude until Sovin Kethrol's archive had assigned Tuesday a threat coefficient. Day 78. The second formal written inquiry arrived. This one was 11 pages and contained 91 questions. The 5th category had been subdivided into 3 subcategories. The new subcategories were temporal cognition and human psychological relationship to cyclical time, observed behavioral patterns specific to Tuesday across human population samples, and what the inquiry listed, in the careful neutral phrasing of someone who has thought very hard about how to ask something that might be offensive, as species-level threat invocation protocols. When and under what circumstances does humanity deploy Tuesday deliberately as opposed to encountering it passively? I read that last one twice. I read it a third time. I sat for a while with it. I answered it, Tuesday is not deployed deliberately. It is not encountered passively. These categories do not apply. Tuesday comes. That is what it does. I answered the remaining 90 questions with the same careful, truthful, impenetrable specificity. I noted in my response to the behavioral pattern subcategory that human productivity patterns on Tuesday had been the subject of sustained research interest, and that the consensus finding was that Tuesday was, in aggregate, the most reliably productive day of the standard 7-day cycle for the majority of human occupational categories. I did not explain why. The why, I thought, would not help them. Then I went back to the transit lane framework and spent 6 hours reviewing the Verath drift boundary correction with my trade analyst, confirming the numbers held under every scenario we could model. And for 40 minutes on day 78, I felt, with some clarity, that we were going to make it. Day 89, Veth came to see me. This was unusual. The protocol officer's role in the formal sessions was coordinative. He managed the procedural framework. He didn't make contact visits during a review period. His presence in the visitor's wing, at the hour he arrived, with no advance notification through the session channel, was the first breach of standard Keth-Savan protocol I had observed in 89 days. He sat across from me in the visitor's wing common room. He was alone, which was also unusual. He placed his protocol register on the table between us, not open, just present, and he looked at me with the expression I had first seen on Sovin Kethrol's face on day 1, the master craftsman expression, the one that said I have encountered a joint I cannot identify. The archivist, Veth said carefully, has asked me to convey that the classification review has progressed substantially, and that the senior archive body has arrived at a preliminary assessment. I said, that's good news. The preliminary assessment, he continued, is that Tuesday presents a classification challenge of a kind not previously encountered by the Keth-Savan archive in 600 years of the Senate exchange. He paused. This is not a concern we raise lightly, or one the archive would ordinarily communicate informally. I understand, I said. The challenge, he said, is not that we cannot assign Tuesday a threat coefficient. We can assign it a coefficient. The challenge is that any coefficient we assign will be, by the archive's own assessment standards, either significantly undervalued or significantly overvalued. He paused again. We cannot determine which. I looked at him. I let the silence do the work. The archive has identified, he said, approximately 14 distinct theoretical frameworks under which Tuesday could be assessed. Under 7 of those frameworks, the threat coefficient falls in the lower quartile of Category 2, modest deterrent, limited yield, geographically contained. Under 4 of those frameworks, the coefficient falls in the upper range of Category 6, sustained duration, systemic impact, wide target scope, endurance coefficient open. He stopped. Under the remaining 3 frameworks, the archive has been unable to produce a finite coefficient at all. That sounds like a thorough review, I said. Veth Gilfrills did something I hadn't seen before, a very brief, very rapid flicker that cycled from closed through half open and back to closed in less than 2 seconds. The briefing notes called it involuntary autonomic expression under significant cognitive load. I had previously thought of it as the Keth-Savan equivalent of blinking hard. The representative will understand, he said, that an open-ended coefficient is not classifiable under the standard Senate framework. I would imagine not, I said. The representative will also understand, he said, that the archive is not accustomed to being unable to classify a declared deterrent. I imagine that's true as well, I said. I kept my voice as flat as I had kept it on day one. The archivist, Vatsalaran said, has asked whether the human representative would be willing to provide additional context. He seemed, in saying this, to be experiencing something that was not quite discomfort but was adjacent to it, the slight tension of a person who has been asked to request something that the system they operate in does not normally permit them to request. Not formal classification metadata, additional context, informally. There it was. I had been waiting for it since day one. Waiting patiently, working the back channel, doing the jurisdictional mapping, being meticulous and present and exactly as baffling as the situation required. 600 years of cataloguing, and all it had taken was a word. I'm willing to provide context, I said, informally, across the table between us. Vatsalaran nodded. He seemed fractionally relieved. I thought carefully about what to say, then I said the truth. Tuesday is a day of the week, I said. It is the second of 7. It has no special properties. It is not a weapon. I said it because I was asked to name our greatest deterrent, and Tuesday was what I was thinking about, because I find Tuesdays generally more manageable than Mondays, and I hadn't prepared a better answer. The silence that followed this was the longest silence I had sat in my career as a diplomat, and I had sat in a great many silences. Vatsalaran did not move. After a period I estimated at somewhere between 15 and 20 seconds, he said, "You named a unit of time." "Yes." "As a primary deterrent." "Yes." "In a formal sonnet exchange." "Yes." A pause. Why? I looked at him. Because I needed your archive to spend 3 months trying to classify something that couldn't be classified, I said. And because your archive is the best in the sector, and I knew it would work if I gave it something that was genuinely there but genuinely uncategorized. Tuesday is real. Your translators confirmed it was in the database. There was nothing false about the declaration. Another silence. You required time, Vatsalaran said slowly. I required a conversation, I said. The formal process wasn't going to give me a conversation. The review did. I leaned forward slightly. I think we have the shape of a deal on the transit lanes. Your mid-level contacts and mine have been working it for 6 weeks. I think if we can convene a formal session in the next 10 days, we can put a framework in front of Suvan Kuthral and the senior delegation and they can approve it. I think it's a deal that works for both sides. I think your people know it works, and my people know it works. We just need the formal session to exist, and the formal session can't exist until the review concludes. I stopped. Vatsalaran sat very still. He had the careful, concentrated stillness of a man deciding something that was not entirely within his mandate to decide. The representative understands, he said finally, that the archive's preliminary assessment will need to be concluded formally. I understand. And that a formal concluded assessment will be entered in the index. I understand. Under what classification, he said, does the representative believe Tuesday should be assigned? I thought about it, genuinely thought about it, which surprised me. I had not expected him to ask. I had not prepared an answer. I turned Tuesday over in my mind, what it actually was, what the archive had found in it, the 14 frameworks, the range from Category 2 to Open Coefficient. Category 8, I said, unknown threat type, non-standard endurance profile, requires ongoing monitoring. Vatsalaran was quiet for a moment. Category 8, he said, has not been used since the Sonnet Exchange's founding. That seems right, I said. Tuesday's been here the whole time. He stood. He picked up his protocol register. He looked at me for one more moment with that expression, the master craftsman expression, the joint he couldn't identify, And then he did something I had not seen any Cuth-Southern official do in 89 days of highly formal interaction. He laughed. It was a short sound, controlled, almost involuntary. The gill frills opened fully for a half-second, the deep charcoal going briefly pale at the edges, and then it was gone and he was composed again, official, the protocol officer in the green-edged collar. "The formal session," he said, "will be scheduled within 5 days." He left. On day 93, we sat back down in the amber light of the Sunat Vol receiving chambers. Southern Cuthrall was third from the left, same as before. His hands were folded. His index register was closed. He looked at me across the table with the expression of a man who has had 3 months to decide what he thought about being outmaneuvered by a calendar entry. The formal session lasted 4 hours. The transit lane framework was presented, reviewed, amended in 2 minor respects, and approved. 12 lanes remained under Cuth-Southern administrative oversight, with joint notification requirements for human transit. 5 lanes were released from the exclusion, with a 12-month review cycle. The Vureth Drift Corridor received the routing modification my trade analyst had identified, which satisfied both parties' operational needs without any jurisdictional concession on either side. The 6 outer stations would stay lit. At the close of the session, before the formal salutation and the completion of the exit records, Southern Cuthrall spoke for the first time since the opening protocol. "The threat archive," he said, in the careful, tonal-marked cadence of a senior Cuth-Southern official making a statement for the record, "has completed its classification review of Tuesday." He paused. "The entry reads as follows: Tuesday, Human Temporal Designation, 2nd Unit of the Standard 7-Day Week. Declared as primary deterrent by Human Diplomatic Representative Myra Custall in Sunat Session, 42nd cycle of the current administrative period. Classification, Category 8 Uncategorizu. Endurance Profile, Self-Renewing Indefinite. Threat Coefficient, Open, pending reassessment at each occurrence." He looked at me. "At each occurrence," I said. "It returns," he said, "every 7 days, a deterrent that returns every 7 days indefinitely without requiring any action by the declaring party." He paused. The archive found it difficult to argue against that characterization. I thought of all the Tuesdays that had ever existed, the ones my mother had worked through and my grandmother before her, the ones that had held ordinary meals and ordinary arguments and ordinary moments of a species getting through the week the same way they'd always gotten through the week, not elegantly, not heroically, just persistently. Every 7 days, without fail, without anyone's permission. "No," I said, "I suppose it would." Outside the Sunat Vol windows, the noon light moved through the Vol crystal, amber and white and pale gold, the same light that had been pouring through the same mineral since before the first Cuth-Southern archivist had opened the first index and started counting. We completed the exit forms. We shook hands in the Cuth-Southern fashion, right hand placed briefly over the folded-in fingers of the left, a gesture the briefings described as meaning, approximately, what I hold in full knowledge of what it costs. I held it. My trade analyst, Pell, was waiting in the corridor outside the receiving chambers when I emerged. She was holding her jurisdictional maps in one hand and a HUD copy of the approved framework in the other, and her expression was the expression of a person who has spent 3 months doing quiet, meticulous, technically demanding work in the service of a plan whose architecture she understood only partially. "Did it close?" she said. "It closed," I said. She looked at the approved framework in her hand. She looked at the stamp at the bottom, the Cuth-Southern coordinating seal, which was an interlocked series of geometric forms that translated visually as something like, "and this too is indexed." She had been looking at that stamp on documents for most of her career. I don't think she had ever seen it on a document like this one. "The lanes," she said. "All 5, I said, "plus the boundary correction. It's a sign correction, not an informal understanding. Duth Sulura's department gets the administrative simplification. We get the corridor. She was quiet for a moment. The corridor outside the receiving chambers had the same vol crystal walls as the chamber itself, and the light moved through them the same way, that slow amber current. Everywhere at once. Pell, I said, what did you think the concrete detail was when you came in? What did you think we were working with? She looked at me. I thought you had intelligence we weren't sharing, she said. A weapons platform capability profile that hadn't been cleared for my access level. Something real. There wasn't anything like that. She processed this. Then what was? She stopped. Something shifted in her face. Tuesday, she said. Tuesday, I said. You declared a day of the week. I did. She looked at the approved framework with its coordinating seal. She looked at the boundary correction notation in the annex. She looked at me. Sovin Kethral's archive has Tuesday in its threat index. Category 8, I said. Open coefficient, reassessed every 7 days. A pause. Every 7 days, she said slowly. They're going to be reassessing it forever. They're committed to the coefficient cycle, I said. It's in the index. They indexed it formally. They don't remove things from the index. Pell put the jurisdictional maps under her arm. She looked at the closed doors of the receiving chambers behind me. I watched her do the mathematics. 600 years of accumulated threat intelligence. 4,313 entries. Every weapon any species had ever brought to a Senate exchange. And now, in perpetuity, Tuesday. The productivity figure, she said. In the second inquiry, you told them Tuesday was the most productive day of the human work cycle. I did. Is that true? According to 4 independent surveys, I said. She was quiet. They're going to be watching us on Tuesdays, she said, for the rest of their institutional existence, specifically on Tuesdays, looking for the weapon. I imagine so, I said. She shook her head very slightly, not in disapproval, in something closer to the expression of a person who has just watched a hand resolved by someone else playing a card they didn't know was in the deck. The lanes are open, she said. The lanes are open, I said. We walked to the transit platform. Orlin called before my shuttle had cleared the docking ring. Tell me, he said. Category 8, I said. Open coefficient, reassessed at each occurrence. He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then, they gave Tuesday its own category. They reopened a category that hadn't been used since the founding of the exchange, I said, for Tuesday. Another silence. Every 7 days, he said slowly, as if he was just now understanding what that meant. They have to reassess it every 7 days. That was the archivist's own formulation, I said. I didn't suggest it. Myra, Orlin said. Sir, the lanes are open. The lanes are open. A long pause. The shuttle's engines shifted pitch as we cleared the upper orbital. Through the port window, the Senate Vol spire caught the light Vol crystal at high altitude, the whole building holding the day's last colors, amber running gold running pale. What made you say Tuesday? Orlin asked. I thought about it, honestly thought about it, the way I'd thought about the classification question. I'd been born on a Tuesday, I said. I don't know. It was the first real thing I could think of, and I figured if it was real it would hold up. Orlin made the sound that was almost a laugh. It held up. For 3 months, I said. For 3 months and counting, he said. They've got it in the index now, every Tuesday, for as long as there are Tuesdays. I thought about that. The Keth Savon Threat Index, 4,313 entries, every one indexed, cross-referenced, coefficiented, and cataloged. Category 8 open, reassessed at each occurrence, self-renewing, indefinite. Second day of the week, named for a dead god, arrives on its own schedule. Yes, I said, I suppose they do. The shuttle banked. The spire went out of sight. The day held for a few minutes more before the planet's limb curved it into dark. Tuesday would be back in 6 days. It always was.